in 1896 on August the 2nd. Quintana had been it was a port, and it had been a nice-sized little town up until the 1900 storm struck, and that practically wiped away everything all around the whole coast, from up the Brazos River to I imagine as far as Brazoria or Columbia. At any rate, it wiped away Quintana and all the surrounding country around Valesco, which had been quite a nice-sized little town up to that time. Everything almost was wiped away from the face of the earth by the terrible tidal wave that struck on September the 8th, 1900. I was only 4 years old when this terrible storm came, but it seems to me that I have some memory of what took place. At the time that the 1900 storm came, my family had moved further toward the mouth of the Bernard. They lived between the mouth of the Bernard River and the mouth of the Brazos River, where I was born. And the little house, of course, where we lived was blown down. And when the storm became very close and was really upon us, my father and mother took the children they had and a few of the small household items and went to Bryan Mound to stick out the storm. At Bryan Mound, there were a number of people just waiting there for the same purpose. Even in 1900, drilling was going on at Bryan Mound, but at that time the drilling was for oil, for gas, and so the storm struck very hard there. It blew down the house where we went into for protection from the storm, and we crawled out of the window since the door was stuck to go to another house close by. And I remember a window pane falling out of a window and cutting off a tip of one of the men's noses. And we, some way or other, weathered that storm like we did many others after that, and stayed there at Bryan Mound for a day or two till the storm was past, when we went back to the little place where we had called home. And of course everything was in ruins, but some way or other my father moved a little bit closer, right to the mouth of the Bernard River this time, and we lived in a little two-roomed house. And he did fishing and some hunting from there. We would go into Valesco for groceries and to ship the hides he had collected during the interval, and maybe take a few fish along to sell, and then go back home. At that time there was a ferry that crossed the Brazos River, and of course it was an experience going over this ferry. And since we lived where there were only two or three, there was an old Norwegian sailor that lived down there, that lived in a little one-room place on the banks of the Bernard River. And we, as usual, had just about 2 rooms to live in. But since my oldest sister was she was about 9 years old in 1902, my mother insisted that we leave there and go to where we could get a little bit of schooling. She had come from a family that had teachers and in it, and so of course she believed that a person should have a little education. However, at that time, people were not particularly interested in an education as much as they became later, especially for girls. So I'm sure it took some arguing probably, but one day my daddy picked us up and put us in his wagon. I'm sure that just about everything we had could be taken in 1 or 2 trips, and he found a little house in Valesco, right almost bordering on the river, and we moved there and lived there till another storm came in. That was in 1902, and so about that time then my mother gave birth to another baby girl. So the same woman that had helped her during the birth of the one just before this helped her also. She had in the meantime moved back to Velasco because she had become a widow during that time and had to make a living mainly by taking in washing or doing anything she could, notwithstanding the fact that she had a family of her own that she had to take care of. So this made us 5 children and my parents. And when I moved to Velasco, I'll never forget how big it seemed to have maybe 45 or 50 houses, maybe a few more or less, where there had been only, you might say, 2 houses. Well, it just seemed like it was the biggest place in the world, really. But anyway, they had a very good school there. That was one thing that we had and took advantage of and enjoyed. And I'm sure that it was about the greatest thing that ever influenced our lives. The teachers at that time seemed so very dedicated. I'm sure that there was very little money paid them, but notwithstanding that fact, they gave their all to teaching the few children that there were in Velasco at that time. And shortly after we moved there, a larger school was built. It had it had 3 teachers, and we thought that was just grand to have that many teachers. And the same teacher stayed with the primary department for many, many years. Her name was McKee, and Mrs. McKee was a wonderful, wonderful woman. They were also some of the main forces in the Methodist Church. There was just a Methodist church there, which freely let the Baptists, if they wanted to have a revival. There were some Baptists there, and there was a small Catholic church and a little one-roomed, I'm sure, black church there. And so every Sunday, of course, not that my parents didn't go to church very often, at least, but the children, we went if we wanted to. We just ditties we liked that way, and so I always enjoyed going to church, and we had some, it was just the same way as it'd been with the teachers. We had some very dedicated ministers to serve the Methodist Church in Valesco at that time. Occasionally, we would have a revival there. I remember one revival that we had there that was preached by John E. Green. He was a retired railroad man, and every sermon that he preached, he always started his sermons with the hymn, "Life is like a mountain railroad with an engineer that's brave." And he was a very, very dedicated man. Even though Valesco was small, I'll have to mention that there was, as far back as I could remember, and I guess that was just about as far back as anybody could remember, there was a newspaper there. At that time, this was called the Valesco World, this newspaper was. And the editor of this newspaper was a man by the name of Mr. O. Nation. He was a stepson to the famed Carey Nation. So, along with I just having nothing that I can know of hardly that people made their living, yet there were people that lived down there and seemed to they existed, whether they had too much of a living or not. About Valesco.
Well, my memory's not any better than yours, I guess.
Talk a little louder.
I went to school way down at the old,
It was the old artesian well.
yeah. And the well was terrible.
Well.
And it was a long old building with all the kids in there. That is Elizabeth. Keys. A bunch of kids. I was in the first grade.
You didn't start till you were 9 years old, because we didn't move to Valesco till you were 9 years old.
And Evan was 7.
And Evan was 7. Well, I didn't go there because I was 6 that year, and you couldn't start, I don't believe, till you were 7, could you?
No. And it must have been a mile or a mile and a half we had to walk.
I'm sure it was at least a mile or a mile and a half.
But before the term was over, of course the new building was finished, and we lived close to it, so we only had a short distance to go to school later.
Yes, I know it. We lived close enough we could go home for dinner there.
Yes.
Do you remember any of the other teachers after, let's see, when you were in the 3rd grade, you got a gold medal, didn't you, for making the highest grades in your class?
In the 3rd grade.
In the 3rd grade.
And Miss McKee, she'd have us learn something for the Teachers Institute that used to meet.
Oh.
I don't remember at an Anglican or... Anyway, she had to go to it. And we had to recite in front of that. They must have been there in Valesco then.
Maybe so. I don't remember
but anyway, I know that we had to recite Hiawatha.
Oh, yes, I remember Hiawatha. Who was Hiawatha? Hiawatha was a little Indian boy.
Well, we had to recite that, and probably other things at other times. That one in particular I remember. And Miss McKee was really a teacher that loved her work.
Yes, and I think she became, when she had 3 daughters, you know, and her oldest daughter married J. Frank Dobie. So, of course, she was a very brilliant very brilliant. It seems like to me that I remember her being, of the three daughters, she was the most brilliant, I guess, of the three.
Oh, of course. But anyway, she was in a higher grade than we were.
Yes,
so
she was older than we were.
We didn't see those kids because there was 3 schoolrooms.
Yes. Well, no, there was upstairs.
One was upstairs. There was 2 upstairs.
There were, yes, the higher 2 were upstairs.
Yes. And so we didn't see any of those girls. Much we had to line up. The boys on one side of the building, the girls on the other, to go up to our rooms. Each grade, each room in a line.
Yes.
To march behind each other, and of course, Ms. McKee had it up through the 4th grade. And we learned a lot in her room.
Yes.
There wasn't any kids there that didn't know how to read like they are now.
No,
They all knew how to read by the time they got out of there.
They certainly did. They knew how to read and they knew how to spell.
They knew everything as far as those studies were concerned.
Yes.
Everything was they liked it, and the teachers gave special attention to the pupils.
Yes.
And, they really taught.
You mentioned one time about riding in the first car that ever came to Valesco. Well, what year was that? Do you remember?
Well, I must have been about 12 years old. It must have been in 19. Let's see, that was about 1905, I think.
About 1905.
Yes, it must have been in 1905.
And that belonged to Mr. Hoskins, who was. I failed to mention the fact that we had a bank there too. And so the bankers' family were a little more prosperous than the rest of the people. They were really fine people, but something happened at the bank, and a lot of people lost everything that they had. Those that had money invested in the bank. Of course, we didn't have any, so we didn't have anything to lose anyway, but there were a good many pretty sad people down there because at one time Valesco was rather an influential city, and we were told that it had people in it, let's see, that were really up in the higher brackets, you might say. But they were reduced by the time we knew them to maybe taking in sewing for people that could afford it. There were a few down there, I guess, that could afford it. But really, this banker had been a real fine person, it seemed like, and there was also a real estate man down there. There was a lawyer. So I just, like I say, I hardly know how they existed before Freeport started, which was about 1912, I guess, or 11 or 12, that they started drilling again and found oil down there.
They found sulfur?
I meant sulfur, yes, instead of oil. They had drilled for oil first, and I imagine they found the sulfur hidden down there, but didn't say anything about it for a few years, and then they discovered the big sulfur mines down there, and since then it's been a growing city. It turned into Brazosport. What we knew as Valesco is Brazosport now, and much to our sorrow, it seems like to me, because I'll always remember it as Valesco, and would like for it always to be there. There was an old cemetery there that they had people, I don't know how far back the cemetery went. I know there were several that had been killed in the 1900 storm that were buried there, and it was one of the most uncared for places, grass as high as your head, and it seemed like nobody cared for the graves that were there at that time. And is there anything in particular that you remember that stands out in your memory about Valesco?
Not especially, except I had a good time there.
Yes. One thing, well, we used to love to go up to the cemetery. There weren't many places to go on Sunday afternoon to walk up to the cemetery and read the few gravestones there, and was one way to spend the afternoon. And
well, I had my first dates there,
yeah,
and I enjoyed going on the parties that we went to.
Yeah, you used to have hay rides and surprise parties.
They built a levee there, and Mrs. Bryan built that levee, and his, of course, his sons, he had 3 sons, and they would furnish the teams for us to go on hay rides and things, and we had such a good time.
Yes.
I really enjoyed living there at that time.
There would be a flood every summer, it seemed like, there till this levee was built around the river to hold the water back, and the man that built it was a man by the name of Bryan, and they were certainly an addition to the young folks down there at Valesco. There was a great tragedy, though, happened to one of them. He was killed by a runaway. That was years later.
Oh.
It wasn't during the time the levee was being built. That Doc Bryan.
Oh, no.
When was that?
No.
It happened later.
No.
They were working somewhere else at that time, I guess, and were they or what?
I don't know where they'd gone to, but Doc was living there. I don't know who he was living with. He was living with Jim or who. But anyway, driving routine in. He ran away and threw him out and killed him. But that was several years later.
That was several years
the time we
later.
were just talking about.
I didn't remember how long
Yes,
it
the
was.
levee had been constructed there for some time before that happened.
There was also down there at Valesco, right on the almost on the river's edge, an old German man. He was a cooper. He built cisterns and barrels and all kinds of things. And besides that, he was a wine maker. He would buy grapes from people, and then he would pay different ones of us a little bit to come over and pick the grapes off the stem so that he could make his wine. He was I'm sure he was a real smart man. I can remember that he used to pay me a dime or 15 cents to mail a letter to Germany every once in a while, and he had a helper at one time by the name of Mr. Wardlow. Do you remember him? He came down there and worked for him a while as a cooper, you know.
Yeah. There was a young fellow.
There was a young fellow, probably maybe from some of his relatives. He was from Houston. Yes, I remember that.
I don't remember his name.
So Mr. Rinley, who was the cooper and the winemaker, he used to send in maybe a bottle of wine sometimes when there was a storm. Do you remember that?
No.
I remember him sending in a little bit of wine, maybe thinking that it had raised the spirits of some of the people. Well, we lived in that little house where we first moved from 1902 till 1909, and in 1909 a real bad storm came. The only warning we had nearly of storms outside of just some of the old folks' sayings about when everything got hot and still and one thing and another. Well, they would put storm flags up on one of the buildings. I don't remember now which storm flag stood for what condition the weather was in, but there was a storm flag would go up when a storm was close, and everybody watched out for that storm flag and started wondering where the storm would strike. There were a few people at that time down there, one family especially I can remember, that used to be well off enough that they'd come up to Houston to get out of the storm. You remember that, you know, Miss Johnson. They'd come to Houston. But we had to stick it out down there where we were. So this little house where we lived when we first moved there, we had lived in for 7 years, and this awful storm came, and so there was a big sheet metal building right close by, and we went into the sheet metal building and stayed huddled there for a while until the storm started blowing that down, and then we went into a large house that had withstood the 1900 storm, and we weathered the storm out, but it completely demolished that little house. We called it the Pink House. It was painted pink, and so we always said the Pink House. Well, then, of course, we had to find another house to live in, so there was a little two-roomed house close to the Pink House, and we went in that and lived for a while, and during that time that we were living there, my brother Evan became very, very sick. It seems to me like I can remember this typhoid fever, but I'm not sure whether it was that or a slow fever or what, but I know that he lay there sick for quite a little while, and it was after, let's see, was it in that same storm that the Follets lived down there, and their house was blown down, you know, on the beach, and they came up there, and their oldest son took typhoid fever, and that was the first time that I guess a trained nurse had ever been down there.
That was before the storm.
It was before the storm, I'm not sure, but anyway, he had typhoid fever, and he died of it. And so we saw from time to time a good many of the ones we knew that would have some terrible thing to happen to them, like the woman that helped my mother, the midwife, I guess you might call her, when my sister was born, also when my brother was born later. Well, she had a son that developed spinal meningitis.
That was years later.
It was quite a few years later. They had moved across the river from Valesco at that time, and he died a horrible death. It was still, I can see in my mind's eye, the old undertaker taking his body up to the cemetery to bury him, and her following along, and she had a little buggy, horse and buggy, and her following along. Of course, they were quarantined, and no one else was supposed to go to the funeral, but that was one of the many sorrows that this woman had to bear. She had many of them, but there were a few other there was a stores, and down there there were two grocery stores, and there were two dry goods stores. one of them was a pretty good sized dragon store. It was owned by a man by the name of we called it Newsbaum. Nussbaum is the way it was spelled, and there was also 2 grocery stores, and there were 2 doctors down there. Oh, one of them, Dr. Carlton, would just make anybody think of an old family. He wasn't all that old, but a family doctor. He had the looks and the manners of a family doctor. And then there was Dr. Jordan, M.D.L. Jordan, Marcus de Lafayette Jordan. He was I guess, more flashy looking doctor. Both of them were real good, though. So I think the people down there were real fortunate to have 2 doctors. So we were not without just about anything you'd find in a small town, and there was a railroad that went down there to Valesco, and of course people would listen and watch for the train to come in, and we were not isolated, you might say, down there. Now, speaking of the stores, these the Newsbaum store, it was owned by a Jew, so the children went to the public school, and when we would have any Christmas program or anything that had to do with Christianity, why, they didn't compel the Jewish children. They could be even excused from the room if they wanted to be while the program was going on. And another interesting thing, speaking of programs, we'd have a little program every Christmas, and when we were dismissed at Christmas time, I don't remember any of the other teachers doing this, but Miss McKee would always have the grocer to bring in a big box, I guess, of oranges and apples and candy and different things, and each one of us would get a nice little bag to take home with us for Christmas from her. So all those things made some fond memories. And can you think of anything else that took place down there that might be of interest? One thing that happened down there was that some real estate man decided to go up north and advertise the country down there. You know, he was a fat man, Mr. tall Horn. And fat, Mr. Van Horn.
No, just Horn.
Horn? Mm-hmm. Was it Horn?
Yeah.
I was thinking his name was Van Horn. Mm-hmm. Well,
his given name might have been Van. I don't remember that, but his...
Horn. Horn. Oh, yes. Well, anyway, he went up around Kansas and all those farming countries up there, and people, he just made such a glowing picture of the country down there that a good many people would give their farms and sell their farms and sell all their possessions and come down there to Valesco to live. When they came down there, they didn't find it at all like he had said it was. Some of them, they say, even found that their lots were maybe out underwater or something. Well, anyway, I remember one old couple that lived in a little house next to where we were living. That was before 1909, but I don't remember just what year it was. But I can remember that old couple very well. They had just everything, I'm sure, up there. It seems to me like they were from Kansas. Those people that lived I don't remember their names, but I remember they had a big old phonograph with one of the big horns on it, and they just had everything that they might have been comfortable with up there. Well, they were some of the most put out people, I guess, that you could possibly think of. I don't remember their names.
Which house did they live in?
The one right where Miss Lester lived and all, you know, for a while. Mm-hmm. Some of them were able to move back, I guess, to where they'd come from, minus just about everything they had. And some of them, I guess, ended their lives down there, but I thought that was really something bad. But after all, the country did develop into expensive land, and it just, but it hadn't at that time. And then another incident that I might say, there was some people that lived on a boat. They came down from Valesco and they came down from Waco down the Brazos River, and they stopped there just right near where we lived, and they were just almost without anything in the world, it seems like, but they were good people though. But they would had a lot of onions. I can remember going down there and watching them cook sometime. She would boil some onions, build a fire out on the riverbank and boil some onions, and then she'd make up some biscuit. They didn't have any shortening, regular shortening. She'd use tallow to make the biscuit with, and bake them on a skillet. And I just don't see how in the world that those people could hardly be thankful. We had little enough, but it seemed to me like that was worse even than we had. The children were real frail looking, and for a little while they lived in the same little house that those people from Kansas lived in. She would take the tiniest scraps. She didn't waste anything, this woman didn't. They were just as clean as they could be, and she would make quilts out of them, and just used everything that they had to get the most out of. I don't know whatever became of those people. And then another family that came there for a while. Family, I say there were several of them. They were some holy rollers or Pentecostal people, and they would gather grapes that grew wild up there and make jelly, and just tried to live off the land as much as they could. And I don't remember either what. I guess they eventually went on to other parts maybe, and somehow or other time just passed, even though sometimes it seemed like the days would be so long that they never would pass, but they would. They'd go by just like they do now. And finally, in in 1913, it used to be that a person could go up to the county seat, which was Angleton, county seat of Brazoria County. And somewhere or other I had gone through the 9th grade and so, because that's as far as they had it at that time.
No, they had the 10th grade.
Not at that time. And
They did now,
they didn't for a year or two there, though. And so I went up there and took an examination and got a county teacher's certificate. And when I saw the first electric lights in the little rooming house or boarding house or whatever it was where I stayed, the first electric lights I'd ever seen. So I passed the examination, and that was, like I said, in 1913, I got a little school up at Liverpool, close to Liverpool. It wasn't right in Liverpool, but it was out in the country, like, and taught out there for a year. And then the next year, then they had put back in the 10th grade. Just for a year, they didn't have the 10th grade. So then I started back to school again and graduated then from the 10th grade down there. And it was, let's see, at that time, I was 17. I guess Evan was 18. He must have been, he was 15 months older than I was. And so, anyway, he decided he'd like to be a preacher. So, with a little encouragement and no money whatever, he got in Southwestern University, and he was going to work his way through college and be able to get a preaching license. And so, anyway, he went up there to work, and the place where he worked, the old man was so hard on him. He just almost worked him to death. Well, Evan developed pneumonia, and so I don't know how in the world he ever lived through it, but he did. He managed to survive through that spell of pneumonia. And so then he stayed at Southwestern University till there was the rumbling of the First World War. Now, before the First World War, it seemed like there was a different country. It seemed like things were so peaceful, even if people didn't have anything much. Well, they seemed to be at peace with one another more than they ever were since then. So in 1917, of course, then, we went, the United States went into the war, and Evan left college and joined the Navy. So he was in the Navy. Then, of course, in 1918, the peace was signed. You remember about that. Is there anything in particular you remember about the war years?
Well, I moved up here to Houston. You know.
In the meantime, Viola she had married, and she and her husband moved to Houston and lived in Houston then for several years. I don't remember just how many years.
Until
after the armistice.
Oh, yes.
Until after the armistice was signed. So Evan then, when he got out of the Navy, he started to school in Washington, D.C., but in the meantime, he had decided that he would try to be an attorney. So he went to law school up there, and George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And while he was there, he developed another real bad case of pneumonia. So for his one of his nurses was a Miss Emily Baldwin. She was supposed to be one of the best pneumonia nurses that they could find. So, of course, he had the GI Bill of Rights. He was going to school on the GI Bill of Rights. There was something or other. I don't know if there's a GI Bill, but for some reason or other, the fact that he had been in the Navy, I know that he had, I don't know if it saved enough money or what.
I don't remember.
Well, I'm not sure how it was, but anyway, he went to school, and she nursed him through that a spell of pneumonia, and fell in love with each other, and married, and she became one of the most wonderful additions that there ever was to our family. Let's see, now he was 27 years old, I believe, when they married. Yeah, he was 27 years old when they married, and he brought her down to Houston to live, and got in with a law firm.
He came here first.
Yes, he came here first.
Law firm.
Yes.
And she stayed up there, and the baby was born up there.
Yes, yes, she did. It was
in Buffalo.
yeah. Yes. So, yes, she came down here after their only child was born and brought the baby. But in the meantime, I had married, and I had come up here to work